Welcome to the African Review with DeBenki. And this is a follow-up to an interview that was done this week on a radio station called, the program is called Focus on Africa. We were discussing what led up to the transatlantic trade, that led up to slavery. And we're having a discussion about it when a caller called in around 5 minutes before the end of the conversation and said that, hey, look here, man, it is Africans who slaved Africans and caused the whole mess in terms of the slave trade. Well, that really created a debate on the program where obviously on the surface, without really looking into it, that can be a quick synopsis of the matter. But however, that is the argument of the British and the French and the German, that hey, that is just their argument. Because if you just throw something out there, how much people gonna really have the time to look into things unless it's a part of a curriculum or institution in our schools? So for the lack of that, hopefully today, this story of King Afonso, who lived around 1491 in the Congo. The Congo geographically today, yesterday would be different from today. It would extend to the mouth of Angola and exit out in the ocean, leading to the transatlantic, to the Atlantic Sea. So let me just preface this. Two islands right in the curve of Africa there. So when you come around the West Africa before you reach South Africa, right in the curve, right out in the sea, Saint Tome and Principe. I just mentioned those two islands for now. So get back to the story of King Afonso. King Afonso is recorded as the first African king to begin trade and contact with the Portuguese in the 15th century. Around the time the Italian pirate Cristobal Colon, whose name in English is Christopher Columbus. Cristobal, he drifted west. He was en route to the east, where he hoped to strike it rich. He hoped to access the trade in India that was mostly controlled by the Muslims there. However, he drifted to the west, where he discovered that he was lost. There was contact and trade between Africans and Europeans before King Afonso. However, his contact and trade pact would be recorded for posterity, generations to come, making him famous for kickstarting the trade of Africans to Europe by way of Portugal, where they would be treated as slaves. King Afonso's throne name was Nzinga Memba. He is said to have changed his name to King Afonso after his conversion to Christianity. What is not often made clear is whether his conversion was entirely voluntary or it was determined by an unsuccessful battle. The terms after a loss or surrender on the battlefield during this era and the most of history and even today would be that the king would be forced to convert to a religion of the victor or sign an agreement provided by the victor. So we can observe the carrot and the stick diplomacy being used as a strategy throughout history and time to divide and conquer. Taking the carrot is to accept the religion of the foreigner and the conqueror, the Wazungu, and to get to trade with them. This gaining access to foreign goods that can be traded locally and also increase riches. Importantly, acquire all kinds of weapons that can be displayed to the fright of the enemy. So the option that here a king would have had after facing up to invaders who have this time have guns, right? The other option is to stick it out, where potential is that the king might lose his head in front of his subjects. And once that happens, it's easy to find a willing subordinate who will accept the goods and the guns and who will use these tools to conquer and subdue the region in the name of the conqueror. Or let's just say invader. It sounds better, more properly fit the situation. One assumption might be, and one angle is that, hey, King Alfonso converted after he heard the good news of Christ. But it is widely known that many African kings did not know what they were signing. And this was also the case in Zimbabwe under the Bulawayo king, Lobenguro. And it was not that the kings were stupid, it was that they were not literate in the languages of the European. And these documents were signed and prepared after an unsuccessful battle, meaning you go up with guns for the first time and you may have lost, and these are the terms being prepared after that loss that the king is being subjected to. So either he's going to take the deal or he is going to stick it out and fight it out. But eventually, even him stick it out and fight it out, even if him run away, leaving the throne vacant, somebody else can be placed in that situation and function as a proxy king. An example of this even happened in Ethiopia. And this is when King Tiwaldros, King Theodore, went to war with the British, and it was unsuccessful. And in that war, it is said that he committed suicide. And the British did not seek to put a British man as king of Ethiopia. Psychologically, it wouldn't work. Too much history. So they placed on the throne Johannes IV. That was the emperor before Menelik. Right? Menelik himself would be victim to the same type of trickery in terms of signing treaties, and these treaties would lead to war. Only thing, Menelik never signed the treaty. After a war, he signed the treaty to avoid war, and it still lead to war. We mentioned Menelik, king of Ethiopia, in about 1894. That would have been very close after the Berlin Conference in 1884. Whenever we speak about Menelik, we mention also his Empress Taito, who always warned him about dealing with foreigners in terms of international and diplomatic affairs. So by the interaction with King Alfonso, who was born in Zingamemba and converted to Christianity, potentially after a war and a battle, the terms and conditions of that war and battle, King Alfonso have been forced to surrender, because at this time the Portuguese and Spanish would have had in their possession the matchlock rifle and would have also had cannons attached to their ships. And when they entered through the mouth of the Congo River and went and entered in the interior of Africa, which is often said that the Europeans never entered into the interior of Africa. Well, this is an example that's on the record of entering up through the Congo River. And also we have other examples which should have been later in about the 17th, 18th century of that entry through the Senegambia River. But these are the earlier penetration through the Congo River where we see on the records. So King Alfonso, so the pact would demand that the king, any such pact signed in a such confrontation, would demand that the king side with his Portuguese counterpart, right? Who are now his brothers in the faith, against his brothers who look like him, his brothers and sisters by blood. You see? So, brother and sister in the faith supersede brother and sister who you can see, neighbor, nephew, uncle, niece. That is the psychology that the religion imposes within the treaty. And then if it is so, and it will be so, because these men are pushing on to conquer and conquest, when I say they, I mean here the Portuguese who penetrated the mouth of the Congo River, when they get into conflict with other Africans, then it triggers that this king who signed this treaty come to his aid against the other Africans. You see the type of mechanism? So in order to even look at that, we have to look from 1492 what was happening in the world. Remember that the Moors just got kicked out of Europe. The Moors are Africans who are under Muslim, the auspice of Islam. And they had controlled that part of Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, all the way west, from 711 to 1492. 700 years, almost 800 years. So we can see this transatlantic slave trade as a reaction from Europe, also a consolidated effort within Europe itself, consolidated in the name of Christendom, meaning Christianity, right? To consolidate the forces and interest of Europe to create this attack on Africa. And not just a retaliation on Africa, but also a means to feed itself because it was barren, right? This was the Dark Ages. So it was cut off from food, feeding itself from the Muslims who were in the east, Constantinople, right? The Ottomans at the time had control Islam. And in the west, the Moors control Spain. So this is a retaliation from Europe now and a consolidated effort. And this is where you see most of the international treaties that start to bind European countries together in a general effort and a consolidated effort for its own security start to form itself. Before that, everybody was just fighting one another in the name of Christianity. Portugal and Spain get a heads up from England and France because they were busy fighting each other in the 100-Year War. So that put Portugal about 50 years ahead of Spain in the slave game, right? In the capture and kidnapping of people who are lawyers and doctors in the western part of Africa and turning them into slaves. You understand? Portugal get like 50 years ahead of Spain, and then Spain get about 50 years ahead of France and Britain. And then eventually Germany, the Dutch, and then everybody get a piece of it. Okay? And that's what create the imbalance why we can see Europe being developed so much to the high-rise buildings and less so in Africa and the Caribbean. This is the beginning of this imbalance and design where for the last 500 years has been a reality. So these kind of treaties are never a full success. We can review the treaty of Queen Amenorrhoea in the 1st century that was signed with Augustus Caesar after a long battle in which he actually captures the head of a statue and brought it as an example, and our people would walk over it and trample it symbolically. So come back on track again. So that's our next treaty. That treaty that have been in the 1st century, actually in the time of Christ. You see how long? You have treaties that go back far, far, far. You have treaty the Battle of Kadesh, which go back with Ramses, that carry back in about the 12th century BC. So the world organized internationally with trade, business, war, diplomacies, treaty, all of that from throughout. All right, history, we can see a whole cachet of diplomatic correspondence where come out the Amarna letters in about 1400 BC, at the time of King Akhenaten. Anyway, jump again. We're there now. We're there about 1734 in the Maroon Treaty at Jamaica. Similarly, it's a controversial treaty because it was a concession. It is a victory for the Maroons at the time, the African people in the West, comparedly to how the West now developed with weapons, organization, and how Africans had been at a downtrodden and a disorganized state now for a couple years, hundreds of years. So The Maroon now, we consider it a victory. However, it is a concessional victory. And this is where we have to be clear and not romanticize the histories in terms of what happened. You see, diplomatically, it's hard for the British send troops. At the time, you have airplane. They have to take boat and the boat slow, and they have to take ship, and then they have to constantly fight the resistance. So after a while, it weird on the British Army and the Maroons. The term Maroons mean you lost. I heard it being used with some people who get lost in a space about a year, so they're marooned in a space. So it just mean it imply lost at sea, right? So the name Maroons came about when Christopher Columbus and others after him would have come across Africans who were already in the West. So they say, wait, these people are maroon, and the name come down. All right. So now the Maroons signed this treaty, and the treaty full of concession. Number one, worst concession of all. It says that the Maroons who used to fight for free slave, right, and the whole and that is how it expanded community. Sign a treaty say they will help the British now to fight against their enemy, including catching any runaway slave, so-called slave, right? Human beings who are being enslaved. So this is where now it get interesting. Even where Taki, who in a Port Maria form a rebellion, and them start to raid plantation, and them raid all a place and take away a whole heap of weapon, and them kick off now. And them are going to start a revolution right over the island now. You understand me? And they are going to link up with like all a Kong Pong, and now them are going to make the link. But guess what now? In the history now, and this is where the history is more dangerous. Yeah, they were introduced like a man named Juan de Bolos as a hero in the history with Taki. But the comprehension of it is that Juan de Bolos was under the clause of the Maroons that compelled the Maroons to go to war on behalf of the British and also help to quell any insurrection. So Juan de Bolos was the sniper who ended up shot Taki and quell that rebellion, right? During the whole rebellion now, eventually, yeah, so this treaty, any treaty African people sign since 500 BC, always been a compromise, because that is the point where we can see the decline in our African power in the world significantly. And we can see that shift beginning at the end of the Bronze Age collapse about 1200, about 1000 BC. That's so. Eventually, the Maroons in Jamaica, it became impossible to keep up to the demands of the treaty, and war continued to break out again and again, until some of the Maroons were deported to Canada, Nova Scotia, and then to Sierra Leone in Africa as the first kind of repatriation, you might say, depending on who is describing these terms. Back to King Alfonso again. So it is said that he sent even his son to Portugal to be trained as a bishop, and this was displayed in his letter to King Manuela. So in the letter to King Manuela now, King Alfonso, and this is a famous letter in history, my complaint say, you slave them people, you capture people as slave, and you know what I mean, they must consider, it's written nicely, must consider different ways to deal with it and to introduce Christianity better than that. You understand me? But we can say European style Christianity being the version that really undermine African societies. Okay? According to professors like Dr. Malefi Asante, prisoners of war resulting from the premeditated conflicts were taken to the twin islands of San Tome and Principe. These are the islands that I mentioned earlier. It's located off of the coast of Gabon, right in the curve of Africa. That's up on the west before it reaches south, out in the Atlantic Sea. So subsequently from here, there were 70 Africans who were supplied through the Congo under this treaty with King Alfonso. 70 was taken to Saint Tome and Principe. From Saint Tome and Principe, they were started the farming there, and then they brought 70 of them to Portugal, and then within a few years the number increased from 70 to 2,000. So that show you how the exporting of Africans began. Another significant figure out of the Congo at the time, this Congo is spelled usually with a Kongo, because this precedes the Congo, which the C is not common in the African language. The K is a more pronounced sound. So the Kingdom of the Kongo. So when King Alfonso now, after him, we learn of another famous queen in the literature and the history, Queen Nzinga. Now, Nzinga is the royal title of the king or queen of the Congo. We had Nzinga, member, becoming King Alfonso. Here we have Queen Nzinga, the queen of Ndongo and Mutamba. She was born around 1623. So this is now about 120 years after King Alfonso establish and create the mess. Either willingly he convert, or it's a loss or a surrender in a battle, and terms and conditions which he accepted, which are going to come bite him and him predecessors. Now we can say 120 years later. So Queen Nzinga fought the Portuguese in an attempt to undo the treaties, to create leverage, to make situation better for our people. She had to fight the treaty that King Alfonso was forced into. Another important figure in the Congo is Kimpa Vita. Kimpa Vita now in around 1684. After find out say the Christianity get bad, our people start to imagine all type of imaginary things, and they imagine being far away and ignore the realities that were right where they were. So Kimpa Vita now, she herself was born into Christianity, right? And she make it officially the state religion of the Kingdom of Kongo. But this is what she do now. She say Jesus is black and Jesus is Congolese. So in order to bring the mind back to the home, that was her improvisation there. So you see, this thing is a development. So yeah, interesting for a panel discussion around some of these issues where we have discussed, in particular this one, who or what caused the transatlantic slave trade. I think for approach this, we have to be able to see multiple angles and not just having our mouths the words that our colonizers has placed there in their interest and in their defense. We must understand the global organization and the strategy for undermine Africa from one continent to the next continent. The difference here, one continent, the northern continent, is now equipped with the cannon guns that are attached to the ship and the matchlock rifle. When you squeeze it, and also pow. It have nothing more to do with bravery and courage. It have nothing more to do with civilization and who more developed. It is just who is more barbaric and focus their energy on creating the weapons of mass destruction, begin to take civilization from benevolent people, and they will eventually create schools and government systems and international treaties and a world order to continue to propel and secure their position in that regard. So it's necessary also to look at how Muslim converts were effective in advancing the slave trade on behalf of their Arab counterparts. The example we use here is one Tipo Tip. Tipo is said to have been born in a Zanzibar, today around Tanzania. It's understood that Europeans themselves seldom penetrated the interior of Africa, but we pointed out that there are examples where there were penetration through the mouths of the rivers, particularly the Congo River. It was men like Tipo Tip who did a lot of the heavy lifting, and this is true. And these men were motivated and convinced after, based on their religious conversions, that their brothers and sisters were their enemies and their colonizers and counterparts were their brothers in the faith. So you see the psychology here. And we have to mention a wonderful book by Ambassador Frank Weston, Trapped Between the Cross and the Quran. Do you have a return ticket? By Frank Weston. It really gives us this dilemma in a modern setting and how it has evolved into the international system and global situation that it is now. So it is said that Tipotip he trailblazed the path leading into the Congo from the east in about the 19th century and open up the way for the worst that would occur in the African continent in terms of atrocities. He was made governor for it by then Belgian King Leopold. That name should ring a bell. All right? It is King Leopold who triggered the whole organization and said, whoa, this thing get mad now. If we allow this man, he's going to just take over the whole place. So we need to call a meeting, and that meeting was the Berlin Conference in 1884, which triggered the scramble for Africa. And this is where Europeans divided the continent, with only exception at the time was Ethiopia. And the next exception, and Ethiopia at the time would have been under British. The British would have clearly had influence in Ethiopia because of the hosting of King Tiwalju's Theodore and the placing of Johannes IV on the throne there. All right. So and then Liberia was set up by American. Liberia and the American colonization society basically I say, hey, we need to send some American go Africa, go through them can get a foothold and a claim in Africa. So and also at the same time they can get rid of someone where I get trouble in a them place. You understand me? Like Edward Wilmot Blyden was a man where them send to Liberia as a missionary. So yeah. So that was the story of the Berlin Conference and Tipo Tip. And unfortunately, Tipo Tip's autobiography has become a standard Swazi literature. And that is a good detail by his account of the madness and his conviction that led to it. So the Congo is often called the heart of Africa. And the general rule, although not always observed, is to distinguish between the Kingdom of the Kongo before 1884 Berlin Conference and the Congo DRC and the Congo in Brazzaville. Regimento, signed 1512, is the agreement between the Kingdom of the Congo, led by Alfonso I, and the Portuguese King Emmanuel, in which the Congo accepted Portuguese institutions and granted extraterritorial rights to Portuguese subjects and supplied human beings that would eventually be treated as slaves to the Portuguese traders. Here's a breakdown of the document. King Alfonso, known for his efforts to convert Congo to Catholicism, sought to strengthen relations with Portugal. Terms of the agreement: acceptance of Portuguese institutions. Congo agreed to adopt Portuguese institutions which likely included aspects of governance and law and potentially religious practices. Extraterritorial rights. Portuguese subjects were granted extraterritorial rights within Congo, meaning they were not subject to local laws and could be tried by Portuguese courts only. Slave trade. The agreement facilitated the slave trade with Congo supplying human beings that would be treated like slaves to the Portuguese traders. Whenever we read that, we have to change it, because it just put it in your mind, say, as a slave. So you have to know if it duck them psychology there, even while reading literature. So, the significance. The Regimento of 1512 marked a significant turning point in the relationship between the Congo and Portugal, solidified Portuguese influence in the region, and contributed to the growth of the transatlantic trade. There are several other interactions with African kings which amount to the same thing: divide and conquer. Once they themselves become conquer, whether if them stick it out, and win, it live to fight another day. And if there is a surrender, then that surrender includes everything that mentioned above: conversion to either Christianity or Islam, and then under the auspices of that, you end up doing the bidding of the converters, the converted, or the muscle of the converters. So this is how religion play a role in the transatlantic slave trade.